Lâu lâu lâu. Viên nó bên lâu lâu lâu.
In early November 2025, a landmine exploded near the Thai-Cambodian border in Sisaket province, injuring Thai soldiers and instantly pushing a fragile peace back into crisis. The blast took place along a jungle trail that locals use for farming and patrols, highlighting how close military risk and everyday life sit next to each other in this frontier region. Within hours, Thailand's National Security Council convened an emergency meeting in Bangkok to assess the incident and its implications for the recent peace commitments. After deliberation, the NSC announced that Thailand would suspend implementation of the Kuala Lumpur Peace Accord with Cambodia, citing serious security concerns along the border. Officials also signaled that the military had been authorized to prepare defensive operations, sending a message at home and abroad that Thailand was ready to respond firmly if needed. Phnom Penh quickly rejected Bangkok's accusations, insisting that no new mines had been laid and arguing that any explosion was the legacy of older conflicts, not a breach of the new accord. As statements crossed the border, Thai and Cambodian talk shows, social media streams, and YouTube lives began dissecting the incident, amplifying both fear and anger among viewers. Supporters of a hardline security approach argue that landmines maiming soldiers leave the government with no choice but to adopt tougher rules of engagement and stronger deterrence. Advocates of diplomatic repair warn that suspending agreements and stepping up military postures risks sliding back into open clashes that would once again uproot civilians on both sides. To understand why a single blast can shake an entire peace process, we need to place this crisis within the much longer history of how this border was drawn and fought over. From roughly the 9th to the 15th century, the Khmer Empire centered on Angkor controlled a vast area of mainland Southeast Asia, including large parts of what is now Cambodia and Thailand. The empire's power rested on an intricate system of rivers, canals, and reservoirs, allowing it to feed cities, support armies, and build the monumental temple complexes we still see today. At the same time, Thai-speaking groups in the region consolidated into early Siamese polities, which began to challenge Khmer influence and expand their own spheres of control. In the 15th century, the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya captured Angkor, an event that Cambodian narratives remember as a national trauma, and Thai narratives often describe as strategic expansion. Despite political conflict, Khmer art, religious architecture, and vocabulary spread deeply into what became Siam, leaving traces in temples, scripts, and ceremonies across modern Thailand. Siamese rulers did not simply copy Khmer models, they selectively adopted and reinterpreted them, weaving Khmer elements into a distinctly Thai royal and religious culture. Throughout this pre-modern era, borders functioned less as thin lines and more as wide zones where influence gradually faded rather than stopping abruptly at a fence. Villages near today's frontier shifted their allegiance over time through tribute, trade, and marriage, long before anyone imagined passports or fixed checkpoints. Modern Thai and Cambodian schoolbooks draw on these centuries in different ways, teaching children contrasting stories about who historically owned key regions along today's border. When politicians or activists now claim that disputed areas were always ours, they are often selecting pieces of this complex shared past to justify present-day territorial claims. In the 19th century, European empires arrived in force, and France gradually built its Indochina colony, turning Cambodia into a protectorate while pushing Siam to surrender territory. French cartographers produced detailed maps that portrayed the new colony's boundaries, including a depiction of the Thai-Cambodian frontier that would later become highly contested. A 1904 treaty between France and Siam called for a boundary commission to mark the border, with the general principle that the line should follow the watershed of the Dângrêk Mountains. In practice, the mapping work in the Dângrêk range proved difficult, and the precise course of the watershed was not always clear on the ground to surveyors and local communities. One result was the so-called Annex I map, which drew the border in a way that placed the Preah Vihear temple complex on the Cambodian side of the line rather than in Siam. At the time, the Siamese government did not file a formal protest against this map, a silence that later became important evidence in legal arguments about acceptance of the boundary. Preah Vihear itself is a Khmer temple built on a dramatic cliff edge, physically accessible most easily from the Thai plateau while historically oriented toward Angkor and the Cambodian lowlands. This mix of geography and symbolism turned the site into more than just a religious complex. It became a powerful marker of identity for both Cambodians and Thais. When both states emerged fully independent after the Second World War, the old colonial sketch of the frontier hardened into a modern international border backed by armies and treaties. In 1959, Cambodia brought the Preah Vihear dispute before the International Court of Justice, arguing that Thailand was illegally occupying a temple that the Annex I map placed on Cambodian soil. In 1962, the court ruled that Preah Vihear stood on Cambodian territory and ordered Thailand to withdraw its troops and return artifacts, a judgment that still frames legal debates today. However, the decision did not settle the exact status of the surrounding plateau, leaving a gray zone where both sides read the same terrain in very different ways. Soon after, the region was engulfed by the wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, with conflicts spilling across borders and drawing in major powers during the Cold War. Border areas between Thailand and Cambodia became rear bases, supply routes, and sanctuary zones for various armed groups, including those opposed to the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh. The rise of the Khmer Rouge, their brutal rule, and the subsequent Vietnamese intervention generated waves of refugees who crossed into Thailand seeking safety in camps along the frontier. All sides in these overlapping conflicts used landmines extensively to protect positions and control movement, creating dense belts of hidden explosives in forests and fields. Even after formal fighting ended, many of these mines and other unexploded ordnance remained in the ground, continuing to injure and kill civilians and soldiers decades later. Both Thailand and Cambodia eventually joined the Ottawa Convention, pledging to destroy stockpiles of anti-personnel mines and clear contaminated areas within an agreed timeframe. Yet limited resources, difficult terrain, and periodic tensions have made full implementation uneven, and some mined areas remain uncleared or only partially mapped. For survivors who lost limbs or family members to explosions, the border is not an abstract line on a map, but a landscape of risk that shapes their daily routines. Villages that depend on cross-border farming and trade are especially vulnerable because new restrictions or renewed militarization can quickly cut off livelihoods and basic services. By the time we enter the 21st century, the Thai-Cambodian frontier carries layers of imperial mapping, Cold War violence, and humanitarian harm, all sitting beneath today's disputes. Against this backdrop, tensions flared again in 2008 when Cambodia sought World Heritage recognition for Preah Vihear, a move that brought the temple back into international headlines. Initially, Thai and Cambodian officials cooperated on the listing, but changing political winds in Bangkok turned the process into a symbol of alleged territorial concessions. Opposition movements in Thailand used the Preah Vihear issue to attack the government, claiming it was giving land away and failing to defend national sovereignty. Street protests, nationalist speeches, and heated TV debates translated a complex legal and historical question into a simplified struggle between patriots and traitors. Between 2010 and 2011, clashes around the temple area escalated into exchanges of artillery and rocket fire that damaged homes, infrastructure, and parts of the cultural landscape. Civilians living near the frontier were again forced to flee, spending days or weeks in temporary shelters while both armies dug in on nearby hills. In 2013, the International Court of Justice issued a further interpretation of its 1962 ruling, confirming Cambodia's sovereignty over the promontory where the temple stands. The decision reduced some legal ambiguity but did not demilitarize the wider border region, where troops and fortifications remained in place on both sides. Domestic media in both countries often framed subsequent border incidents through nationalistic lenses, making it politically risky for leaders to appear too accommodating. As a result, by 2025, the frontier was still a place where small incidents could quickly activate narratives and networks built during the 2008-2011 crisis. The immediate trigger for the 2025 border war came in late May, when a clash left a Cambodian soldier dead and sparked a series of retaliatory actions. Skirmishes soon spread along several stretches of the frontier, with each side accusing the other of crossing the line and starting new engagements. Artillery fire and small arms clashes drove tens of thousands of residents from border districts, forcing them to move inland or into makeshift camps away from the fighting. International organizations warned that a prolonged conflict could destabilize the wider Mekong region and undermine post-pandemic economic recovery in both countries. ASEAN convened emergency meetings to urge restraint, but the bloc's consensus-based diplomacy initially struggled to stop the violence on the ground. Malaysia, serving as a key mediator, proposed a framework that would allow both governments to step back without losing face, linking a ceasefire to monitoring and talks. At the same time, United States President Donald Trump used the leverage of ongoing trade and security discussions to press both Bangkok and Phnom Penh to accept a ceasefire formula. On 28 July 2025, the two sides agreed in Malaysia to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, formally halting the most intense fighting of that year. The ceasefire text also referred to the creation of joint border committees and ASEAN observer roles, aiming to provide mechanisms for transparency and communication. As shells stopped falling, displaced families cautiously returned to damaged villages, trying to rebuild homes while watching for signs that the truce would hold. Isolated incidents and mutual accusations continued through September and October, revealing how shallow trust remained despite the formal agreement. Diplomats and security officials therefore began drafting a more detailed political accord to turn the ceasefire into a broader roadmap for demilitarization and demining. That roadmap took shape on 26 October 2025 in Kuala Lumpur, where the prime ministers of Thailand and Cambodia signed the Kuala Lumpur Peace Accord with regional and international witnesses. The accord promised withdrawal of heavy weapons from sensitive areas, the deployment of joint monitoring teams, coordinated landmine clearance, and the release of prisoners of war. Official speeches at the ceremony described the agreement as a turning point, but many analysts noted how similar promises in other conflicts had often been difficult to fulfill. In the days that followed, soldiers on both sides conducted joint or parallel patrols in certain sectors, and demining teams began marking and clearing high-risk zones. The early November landmine explosion in Sisaket occurred against this backdrop of cautious implementation, immediately raising questions about whether someone had violated the accord. Thai intelligence and military officials reviewed field reports and concluded that the blast suggested new mine-laying, an assessment that directly challenged Cambodia's public position. On that basis, the NSC announced that Thailand would suspend its obligations under the Kuala Lumpur Peace Accord, arguing that security for its personnel could not be guaranteed. Cambodia responded by denying any new mine deployment and accusing Thailand of using the incident as a pretext to step back from commitments it had made only weeks earlier. Legal experts now debate whether the suspension aligns with international law and the spirit of the Ottawa Convention, illustrating how law and politics intersect at the border. Diplomats warn that with the accord on hold, the diplomatic space for de-escalation has narrowed, even if both sides say they want to avoid a return to full-scale war. Today, the Thai-Cambodian frontier acts as a mirror, reflecting not just local disputes but also broader questions about identity, memory, and security in mainland Southeast Asia. The long story of treaties, court rulings, and mine ban commitments shows how tools of law can restrain violence, yet also how easily they can be sidelined when political pressure rises. Domestic politics and nationalist narratives in both countries can turn an ancient temple or a single blast into a test of patriotism, making compromise appear dangerous or disloyal. The crisis also tests ASEAN's capacity to manage security tensions among its members while maintaining the principle of non-interference and consensus decision-making. Looking ahead, observers sketch out scenarios ranging from renewed clashes to a frozen low-intensity standoff to a gradual confidence-building process that finally demilitarizes the border. Which of these paths becomes reality will depend on decisions in Bangkok and Phnom Penh, but also on how citizens, neighbors, and outside powers choose to respond to this latest shock.